Hello, everybody. My name is Pablo Boczkowski. I'm a faculty member at Northwestern University and the director of the Center for Latinx Digital Media. Thank you so much for joining us for today's weekly virtual seminar of the Center. It is really a pleasure to have you with us. The mission of the Center is to create knowledge about digital media in Latinx and Latin American communities across the Americas. Today's speaker is a leading scholar in this space. Laura Isabel Serna is Associate Professor of Cinema and Media Studies and History at the University of Southern California. Yena Lee, a doctoral candidate at Northwestern University, an affiliate of the Center for Latinx Digital Media, will introduce Laura Isabel in just a minute. I am delighted to note that this quarter, our series is co-sponsored by the Alice Kaplan Institute for the Humanities, the Buffett Institute for Global Affairs, the Center for Global Culture and Communication, the Department of Communication Studies, the Department of Radio, Television, and Film, and the Program in Latin American and Caribbean Studies. But before we go to the seminar, I would like to start by acknowledging that Northwestern is a community of learners situated within a network of historical and contemporary relationships with Native American tribes, communities, parents, students, and alumni. It is also in close proximity to an urban Native American community in Chicago and near several tribes in the Midwest. The Northwestern campus sits on the traditional homelands of the people of the Council of the Three Fires, the Ojibwe, Potawatomi, and Ottawa, as well as the Menominee, Miami, and Ho-Chunk nations. It was also a site of trade, travel, gathering, and healing for more than a dozen other native tribes, and is still home to over 100,000 tribal members in the state of Illinois. It is within Northwestern's responsibility as an academic institution to disseminate knowledge about Native peoples and the institution's history with them. Consistent with the university's commitment to diversity and inclusion, Northwestern works towards building relationships with Native American communities through academic pursuits, partnerships, historical recognitions, community service, and enrollment efforts. Let me say briefly a little bit more about how the seminar will unfold. First, Yena will tell us more about Laura Isabel's research and career in just a minute. Then Laura Isabel will present her work, and after that, we will open for questions. Please enter your questions in the Q&A function of the webinar at any point in time during the talk. Yena will moderate. At the end, we will deliver some closing remarks. Once again, many thanks for joining us, and without further ado, Yena, the screen is all yours.
Thank you, Professor Boczkowski, for giving me the opportunity to present Dr. Laura Isabel Serna. Dr. Serna is Associate Professor of Cinema and Media Studies and History at the University of Southern California. Dr. Serna received her PhD from Harvard University and her BA from UC Berkeley. Her research has been supported by numerous grants and fellowships, including an Andrew W. Mellon postdoctoral fellowship and a Fulbright Garcia Robles fellowship. Trained as a cultural historian, Dr. Serna's primary research focuses on race and media, Latinx and Mexican film cultures. She is an accomplished author of Making Cinelandia, American Films and Mexican Film Culture Before the Golden Age, published by Duke University Press in 2014. She is also the co-editor and co-translator with Colin Gunkill of a volume entitled There Are No Hispanic Stars, Collection Writings of a Latino Film Critique in Hollywood, 1921 to 1939, that makes the fiction and film criticisms of Gabriel Navarro, editor of the entertainment sections of La Prensa and La Opinión in the 1920s and 1930s, available in English for the first time. The book is scheduled to be published in 2023 through the Los Angeles Chicano Studies Research Center Press. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Laura Isabel Serna.
Thank you, Yena, for that kind introduction, and thank you, Pablo, for inviting me to present my work at this virtual seminar. When Pablo first contacted me, I wrote him back and said, "Oh, you must be mistaken," because those of you who know my work will know that I don't really have a lot to say about the contemporary period. I am still firmly stuck in the analog past. I am, however, extremely grateful for the opportunity to think with you today about how focusing on distribution, what Elisa Perrin calls the space in between, changes our understanding about what we think is a well-known past, in the case of the talk I'm going to give today, the golden age of Mexican cinema, but also to think more about how distribution might help us understand media industries and their long history, including the contemporary period. So I'm going to share my screen here. There we go. This presentation, a set of early musings really, is part of a larger project that is focused on constructing an account of the Mexican film industry as an industry during the period that we typically refer to as the golden age of Mexican cinema. That project moves away from the text and star-centric accounts of the period, and instead, building on research by Andrew Paxman, Seth Fine, Francisco Peredo Castro, and others, offers a materialist historical account of how the Mexican film industry came into being. I have been inspired in this endeavor by my colleague Nitin Goville's interrogation of the seemingly common sense category of media industries. In his contribution to a 2013 Cinema Journal dossier on the turn toward media industry studies in the field, Goville asks us to see industries like other forms of cultural and social life as a set of what he calls social and textual arrangements and sites of enactment. That is, rather than being fixed, Goville contends that media industries are contingent and shifting, even as, or perhaps especially as, they become recognizable as industries. Thus, in this project, I focus not on Golden Age films, which other scholars have ably analyzed for their distinctive narrative and aesthetic qualities, nor on stars, who likewise have received a great deal of scholarly attention, nor even, and this is actually something I'm quite interested in, on audiences and their reception of Golden Age films, but rather on the industry's political economy, its business structure, and the social landscape that undergirded it. The Mexican film industry, my research to date suggests, emerged not solely or even primarily out of state support offered in return for the film industry's support and promotion of the Mexican government's ideological messages, but rather out of conflict and collaboration between various groups of historical actors with a stake in the industry's success, a success that they often define differently, depending on where they were situated. Those groups included the Mexican state, obviously, Mexican entrepreneurs, companies, and workers, but they also included the US State Department, American film companies, American investors, and even American technical and creative workers. There were, we might say, a lot of cooks in the national film industry kitchen. Today, I'm going to look at a series of labor conflicts that racked the industry over the course of the 1930s and 1940s. These disputes, primarily between Mexican workers and the Mexican-based distribution offices of the major Hollywood studios, demonstrate, to my mind, two things. First, the intimate relationship between the Mexican film industry, defined here broadly as production, distribution, and exhibition, and American companies, and two, the importance of the process of distribution as a site where various stakeholders in the industry could contest power and attempt to shape that industry. Importantly, in the context of Mexican cinema, one of the key points of debates was who would benefit from the profits that were being generated by the circulation and exhibition of films. I'm going to begin by sketching the state of scholarly inquiry into distribution and the Mexican film industry in the, and particularly in Mexico in the field of media studies. Then I'm going to use the release of Mexico's first sound film as a window into the discourse on the Mexican film industry in the early 1930s, before looking more closely at conflicts that emerged around distribution in the mid-1930s and early 1940s. And what they tell us about how social actors at the time perceived the industry as it was in the process of becoming a sector of national importance. As media studies scholar Elisa Perrin has noted, the digital age has fueled dramatic changes in how media circulates. New formats and platforms have produced new agents and intermediaries, in addition to creating significant changes in distribution processes and their physical infrastructure. For the most part, when scholars whose work might usefully be gathered under the umbrella of media industry studies address distribution, it's in the context of these changes. So there's a great deal of work that focuses on the contemporary period. This is certainly true of scholarship on media industries in Mexico, which focuses primarily, though not exclusively, on trying to understand the trajectory of films produced in Mexico by Mexican creatives, typically with Mexican capital, that is, on national cinema. So people are preoccupied with trying to figure out where the place of national cinema is in this new age. In his book, Shadow Economies of Cinema, Mapping Informal Distribution, Ramon Lobato examines film piracy in Mexico as a complex set of practices that plays a role not only in the circulation of media, but also, he argues, in the maintenance of Mexico's national film culture. Lobato's examination of underground or informal film distribution via a case study of a DVD vendor in the famous or infamous tianguis in the working class barrio of Tepito is part of his broader project to ask scholars to look at informal distribution networks as closely as they look at formal distribution networks. In contrast to Lobato's examination of these informal distribution networks, communication scholar Rodrigo Gomez Garcia analyzes what we might think of as the formal contemporary Mexican film industry, observing that although the production sector has become stronger, the general performance, and I'm quoting him, of the Mexican film industry has been shaped under the conditions, logic, and dynamics of the Hollywood majors and free market imperatives, end quote. He concludes that since 2000, the Mexican film industry has been what he calls assimilated by the American media industry, in large part because Hollywood controls major distribution platforms and its products dominate the exhibition sector. That is, for Gomez, the potential success of the Mexican film industry, defined in his analysis as the production and circulation of domestically produced films, is dependent on distribution. So we have these two models of informal and formal distribution as modes of producing national cinema. And the vendor that Lobato studies is one who makes available golden age films that aren't available in other ways. And in this way, he argues, kind of helps circulate this memory of national cinema. Distribution has, however, been downplayed in historical accounts of Mexican cinema. This is a significant oversight, given that, as film historian Lee Griebeson argues, beginning in the 1920s, quote, control of distribution infrastructure and exhibition was integral to the realization of rental values, end quote. That is, distribution was the key for profitability in terms of US film companies. In other words, distribution was at the center of the American film industry's global dominance. Looking at how the American film industry's vast distribution network operated in one corner of the world, Mexico, was in part the work of my previous research, through which I argued, to put it succinctly, that a national film culture need not be built from an engagement with national cinema. Keeping that in mind, it's almost common sense that struggles on the part of other industries to carve out domestic or international market share in the face of Hollywood's dominance would take place around distribution. So that's kind of setting the stage about how we can think historically, or why we should think historically about the importance of distribution. Though my previous research explained that Mexican audiences on both sides of the border found ways to integrate both American films and their accompanying film culture into their own social and cultural identities, my research also confirmed that Mexican audiences could love Hollywood films and at the same time long for something produced closer to home. In the words of one critic writing in the mid-1930s, Mexican and other Latin American audiences longed for, quote, cinema to touch their souls, cinema that interests them, that reflects their own lives, and that serves as spiritual nourishment for their own sensibility. This is a very poetic rendering of this desire. This was the work that domestic film industries, like the one that would emerge in Mexico, were thought to be ideally situated to do. Indeed, one might think, in reading popular and even scholarly accounts of Mexican film in the 1930s and 1940s, that the introduction of sound opened the door for a film production industry that had merely been waiting for an opportune moment to emerge and address this desire. An emphasis on the production of films and scholarly accounts certainly supports this interpretation. However, the emergence of the Mexican film industry as an industry whose contribution to the national economy and importance as a source of employment would be substantial by the mid-late to late 1940s was an uneven process. While Hollywood, at least before 1948, was comprised primarily of vertically integrated companies that controlled production, distribution, and first-run exhibition, and they were also companies that maintained a stable of creative personnel that worked together to produce films that often hewed to a kind of studio house style. Mexico's cinema sector was spread out horizontally. A few production companies, mostly in the federal district, made films, but production could be intermittent, even for the most well-capitalized companies. Feature films by domestic production companies often did not circulate for very long or very widely, even though they were met with delight by audiences and critics. Most films that circulated in Mexico came from Hollywood studios. This was true in the 1920s, it was true in the 1930s, and it was true in the 1940s. Thus, film distribution, the movement of films from their source to theaters, was primarily in the hands of the major US film companies, many of whom had set up shop in Mexico during the late silent period. Through offices in Mexico City and branch offices in major urban centers, these distributors signed contracts with theaters or circuits of theaters, packed and shipped films to their destinations, and once films were returned, reviewers inspected them to make sure they were usable by the next client. So there was a lot of activity going on in these distribution offices. The exhibition sector, and I made this table to help my own thinking, but also I think it's helpful to keep in mind, was for the most part the domain of Mexican entrepreneurs. As I discussed in my monograph, Making Cinelandia, in 1923, the newly formed Department of Labor conducted a census of the film industry in Mexico. In the department's thinking in 1923, that industry consisted entirely of film exhibition. The census asked questions about the amount of capital theater owners had invested in the business, their hours of operation, the number of workers and employees, and how many of these employees belonged to a labor union. This compilation of data and production of statistics gave bureaucratic shape to a loose and extensive collection of independent enterprises. The theaters that they queried ranged from itinerant exhibition to collections of theaters in the capital. So it was a very widely ranging, there was no uniformity to these ventures. In the 1930s and 1940s, theaters continued to be primarily owned and operated by Mexican entrepreneurs. The case of William Jenkins' exhibition empire built in the 1940s via the use of prestanombres being a notable exception that really angered many Mexicans who felt that he was underhandedly taking control of the exhibition sector. Mexican film production, like domestic production in other countries, received a boost from the introduction of sound technology. As in other parts of the world, individuals and companies sought to take advantage of the opportunities created by sound to make films that would appeal to domestic audiences. Take, for example, the production of Mexico's first sound film, Santa, directed by Antonio Moreno, a Spanish actor who would become a Hollywood film star. It was produced by the newly formed Compañía Productora Nacional. Despite its name, the company was not a government-sponsored endeavor, but a project led by silent film producer and director Gustavo Sáenz de Cecilia and a cadre of investors from Mexico's banking and industry sectors. Those investors positioned their financing of the production company as nationalist labor, a claim that the company's logo made in graphic form. And there's a pretty bad screenshot of their logo here, which is a kind of graphic representation of the eagle with the serpent in its mouth. A tactic that Rosario Vidal Bonifaz notes was common at the time. Because while the trade press, both in English and in Spanish, acknowledged that Santa was met with curiosity and even approval by Mexican audiences, reports about the film's production and release acknowledged that the production sector of the Mexican film industry could not yet be called an industry. For example, in an interview with the film's director published in Cinelandia, which was a Spanish language kind of fan/trade publication that was edited in Southern California, Moreno was asked directly about working conditions in Mexico. He noted that in contrast to Hollywood, Mexican film production lacked organization, his phrase, and that there was, quote, a shortage of supplies and experts, end quote. These considerable challenges were, he noted, compensated for by favors from government officials who were anxious to help facilitate the production success. Likewise, a report on the film business in Mexico published in the American trade magazine, The Motion Picture Herald, reassured its readers that Santa, which had just been released, was popular, but that, quote, the native industry is still very much in its infancy, and that at heart, Mexicans prefer Hollywood productions. In sum, while they watched developments in production with interest, American film companies felt very secure about their position in the Mexican market. And I've begun to think about this early period of the 1930s as being comprised of national films without a national film industry. While they were not terribly concerned about competition from Mexican film producers, over the course of the 1930s and the early 1940s, American film companies expressed concern over changes in the Mexican government's film-related policies and the growing power of organized labor across the film sector. During the 1920s, film companies had enjoyed relatively favorable tariffs and had operated with very little oversight. This changed with the introduction of sound technology. During this period, American film distributors complained about tax increases and prohibitive tariffs, most of which were designed to nurture, if not protect, domestic film production. They asserted, these companies, losing money because they had to pay customs duties, duties on rental contracts, taxes on profits from the rental of films, taxes on money sent abroad, patent rights on capital, fees for the review of films, their share in the tax that they collect in the cinemas, income tax, various custom fees, and stamp taxes on contracts. This is from one of their letters of complaint. Over and over again, these companies threatened to close up shop and leave Mexico. Making good on that threat would imperil the livelihoods of not only the majority Mexican workforce in the industry, but also Mexican theater owners whose business model relied on American films. I'll offer one vignette as an example of this kind of reaction of American film companies to these new regulations. In the fall of 1934, the president of United Artists, Joseph Schenck, announced that the company was contemplating leaving the Mexican market. Revisions to the Mexican tax regulations had made a substantial increase in taxes seem imminent and threatened to turn film distribution into a losing proposition. The legislation revising this code specified that taxes would be raised, and it's very specific in the language of the legislation, on the foreign companies that obtain income in their country from the exploitation of motion pictures. So these film distributors felt singled out. For US film distributors, this seemed to imply that they would begin to be taxed at 16% rather than 10%. These companies protested this increase, first disingenuously misreading el impuesto sobre la renta as having to do with rental income rather than income in general. They argued that they could not sell their films outright in Mexico because that would, in their words, necessitate the importation of hundreds of prints, and the articles sold would be shown a few times by a theater and then be without further value to the exhibitor. This, it would seem, was not the only misunderstanding, as US film distributors were soon informed that the tax increase would apply not to gross receipts, but only to profits that were sent back to the United States. This set of regulations, though they would be modified after protests by US companies, set the stage for President Lázaro Cárdenas's January 1935 decree that gave the Mexican Congress the ability to pass legislation dealing with the cinema industry. So the film industry went from being really loosely regulated, kind of more locally regulated, to being the object of kind of federal legislation. And in this way began to inhabit a new regulatory landscape. This legislative and regulatory scene was complemented by increasing labor activism on the part of the Sindicato de Trabajadores de la Industria Cinematográfica, or the STIC. The stick emerged out of the Unión de Empleados Confederados de Cinematógrafo and its successor, the Sindicato de Empleados Cinematografistas del DF. So these very early kind of labor organizations. The former, the Unión, was a mutual aid organization rather than a union per se that had been created by workers in cinemas in DF who chafed against what they perceived as the despotism of the foreign nationals employed as cinema managers by various theaters in the federal district. And coincidentally, last month, the stick celebrated its 100th anniversary. Its Facebook page was replete with images and memories by its members. Over the course of the late 1920s, the sindicato absorbed workers from across the industry. Sections were formed for the people in charge of publicity, such as posters, the workers who distributed the posters and the handbills, and technicians who worked in the newly established cinema. So this union began to grow and grow and had various different sections, I guess is what they were called. From the beginning, however, the largest contingent of workers in the sindicato were not involved in production at all, although that is how we typically think about film unions, but rather in exhibition and distribution. So when labor conflicts erupted in the 1920s, the Unión, later the Sindicato, their labor actions involved what they called closing cinemas. That is, union members just withheld their labor as projectionists, ticket takers, janitorial staff, mozos, the veladores, they just simply would stop working. In the 1930s and 1940s, labor actions increasingly revolved less around exhibition, although exhibition was still really important and was certainly affected, and increasingly around distribution. In early 1935, when it was time to negotiate a new collective contract with the workers in their offices, film distributors claimed that Mexico's regulatory regime made it impossible for them to accommodate the union's request for a general increase in wages for the workers who performed a variety of jobs in the offices of American distribution firms. So these are clerks, these are film reviewers, these are empacadores, the people who packed, men mostly, who packed the films into crates and then sent them off, etc. So they said, we can't do it. So in the late summer of 1935, when the stick threatened to strike, it was on behalf of those workers in the distribution sector who, according to one newspaper, simply sought salary increases. The union threatened to bring the film business in Mexico to a halt simply by refusing to touch any of the films that came into their offices. They would neither process incoming films nor review films that came back from being out on loan to ensure that they were ready to be shipped out again. Exerting pressure via a strike was the only way many union members believed to effect changes in their working conditions. The distributors, one union member had declared in a meeting, are only accustomed to complain about and exploit the workers, demanding a lot without taking anything into consideration, without the pressure of the organization, the union. In their action against the distributors, the stick received support from a wide range of other unions, including graphic artists, oil workers and drivers in Tamaulipas, the Sindicato de Trabajadores de Molinas y Nixtamales in Tampico, and theater workers in Morelia, many of whom wrote to President Lázaro Cárdenas, urging him to, quote, resolve this issue in favor of the affected workers as quickly as possible. And they kind of called to his attention his stated commitment to the benefiting collectives of workers in this new kind of labor consciousness in Mexico that sought to realize the provisions that had been written into the 1917 Constitution. The labor action by the distribution workers proved effective. Enrique Zeiner, who was the representative of American film distributors in Mexico, they had organized themselves into an unofficial business interest group that they called the Film Board of Trade. It had this very fancy name, but was actually just them getting together like a lobbyist group. Wrote that the Sindicato had managed to, quote, stop the exhibition in every one of the theaters, where the US film distributors, pictures were being passed. Indeed, for 4 months during this standoff between the companies and their workers, no American films were distributed in Mexico, meaning that after the films that were already in circulation in the country had been screened, the exhibition sector would halt, essentially. Josephus Daniels, the US ambassador to Mexico, wrote to the Secretary of State in February of 1936 that the only pictures shown in Mexico have been films made in Mexico or brought from Europe. So disruptive was this strike that US film distributors set in motion a plan to close operations in Mexico. F.L. Herron, head of the Motion Picture Producers and Distributors of America, reported back to Fox film executives in New York that the foreign managers of companies operating in Mexico had decided to invoke a 30-day cancellation clause. So film distributors in turn threatened to simply stop doing business. They wrote, "There shall be no prints shipped, contracts or spot bookings made, or releases of any type." Herron wrote this to the State Department. He assured American diplomats that ultimately it would be, quote, "impossible for the theaters in Mexico to keep open without American pictures," end quote. Even the resolution of the conflict revolved around distribution. Zeinart relayed that in the course of mediation, an unnamed party suggested that US film distributors take on for complete distribution in the Spanish language market a total of 24 Mexican-made pictures per year. It's unclear from the historical record if this suggestion was taken up, although in the 1940s, American film companies would become important, perhaps the most important distributors of Mexican films in other parts of Latin America and the southwestern US. But the accommodations made by the Mexican government to appease American film interests in the wake of this strike worked to facilitate the circulation of American films. The dreaded tax increase was lowered to 6%. Import duties on sound films in languages other than Spanish, so in English, and sound films that required discs were lowered substantially, while duties on the discs themselves, the sound discs, were raised in an attempt to force Mexican theaters to install equipment necessary to show films whose soundtracks were recorded on the film itself. So that's kind of a separate story, but the US film distributors have a lot of power, I guess is the takeaway there. What did the distribution office workers receive? Salary increases of 25%, 80% of the pay that they had not received during the strike to be paid out over a series of months, and importantly, healthcare services, which was a not insignificant benefit. Unresolved went the issue of whether the inspectors who checked and approved box office reports would be considered management and thus under control of the company, or would be appointed by the union. And so business continued, with over 80% of the films being shown in Mexican theaters coming from the United States, and a significant portion of the workers in the film industry working for those companies. Over the course of the 1940s, this push and pull continued to characterize labor relations between the sindicato and American distributors. Subsequent, if shorter, labor conflicts erupted over the following years. The issues remained the same: wages and working conditions. For example, distribution workers struck again in the late summer of 1941. And by October of that year, exhibitors began to feel the lack of American films. The Mexican public newspapers reported preferred new films, they preferred American films. And during the strike, exhibitors could only show older films, which made, one observer reported, audiences unhappy. Exhibitors who were bound by collective contracts with their employees, who were members of STIC, began to seek permission from the labor board to reduce their staffs, as did distributors. And vibrant offices like this one, and this is actually a picture from slightly later from the 1950s of a Universal International distribution office during the course of a kind of sales contest, right, became quiet. Reporters began to inform the public that distributors would pack up all the films that still lingered on their office shelves or that had been returned from theaters and go back to the United States. This was never going to happen, but they threatened it regularly. Compared to the 1935 conflict, this strike was brief. It was resolved by mid-October. Nevertheless, it just demonstrates how even as the Mexican film production sector grew, disrupting the flow of films from the United States could throw the industrial ecosystem of Mexican cinema into a crisis. Mexican film production, while increasing, was simply not enough to fill the gaps in exhibition programs. There are, to my mind, two stories to be found in these accounts of the Sindicato struggle to win significant gains for its membership from their American employers. The first is a more conventional story in which Mexican workers resent the actions of their American employers. Sindicato employees were not immune. In fact, they were infected with the nationalist fervor, Mexico for Mexicans, that animated the 1930s. And they frequently beseeched the Mexican government to invest in the Mexican film industry, spinning out projects ranging from worker cooperative distribution companies to more fanciful ideas. For example, in 1940, the Union of Trabajadores de Estudios Cinematográficos, which was the STIC section 2 of people who actually labored in the studios. So by 1940, that was a section that had been formed. They suggested that one way the government could help the domestic film industry would be to find a way to force American distribution firms that, in their words, annually reap profits of 8 to 10 million pesos to invest a portion of that money in production in Mexico and then use their vast network of distribution to distribute those films, right? And they thought that this was an incredible idea and that the US film companies would generate a lot of profits for themselves and also benefit Mexican workers. So that's one story, this kind of contest. But there's also a story about the fundamental importance of distribution in the complex of business practices, infrastructure, and discourse that we recognize as the Mexican film industry. By the mid-1940s, the cinema workers' unions, which by then included every imaginable role in production, distribution, and the exhibition of films, had become one of the most powerful unions in the country. Its power, some critics asserted in the press, was shadowed only by railroad and petroleum workers, industries that coincidentally, perhaps not coincidentally, had also developed with the investment of foreign capital and expertise. And disrupting distribution, the process of moving films from one place to another, continued to be a key tactic in industry labor conflicts. And I'll end by, or kind of wrap up by telling you another short story. In 1946, another labor conflict emerged, but this time the debate was between different ramos rather than between employees and employers. This is a long and complicated story that I don't have time to tell, with twists and turns that included, among other tense moments, a hunger strike and a fisticuffs between a famous actor and a famous director. For the sake of economy, I'll abbreviate the main issue as follows. The creative people, this STIC section 2, who were involved in film production, wanted to separate from the Sindicato, which by then had 47 sections, as well as branches in various cities across Mexico. And they wanted to create their own separate union. They accused the Sindicato's leadership of corruption. Some of these accusations were certainly true, and believed that a large and ungainly institution such as the Sindicato could not possibly defend their very distinct interests. While the Sindicato, fearing that it would lose control of the industry's workers, sought to prevent this schism at any cost. Now, this episode, which is basically the formation of the Sindicato de Trabajadores de Producción Cinematográfica, or the STPC, has been written about at length by scholars, in part because it was protagonized by well-known figures, including actors Cantinflas and Jorge Negrete. And it might seem like this has little to do with the other labor conflicts I've described, but workers continue to see the flow of films or distribution as a key pressure point. And this is meant to be blank, sorry. In this case, the inter-union conflict led to a boycott of Mexican films, which sat in cans, unscreened, as Mexican producers pled with the government to intervene, and workers in various sectors of the industry accused one another of undermining national cinema. Thus, creating breaks in the chain of distribution became a broader industrial strategy for leveraging power, not merely a tactic employed in contests between American stakeholders and Mexican employees. During the so-called golden age of Mexican cinema, distribution, controlling what film historian and theorist Nilo Corret describes as the flows and friction of commodity circulation, became a key site of struggle for workers and capital alike, as they sought to determine who would benefit from increasingly robust and profitable domestic and international markets for films produced in Mexico, as well as the considerable profits generated by the exhibition of American films within Mexico's borders. These conflicts shaped not only what Mexican audiences saw on screen, but also the circulation of domestically produced films in Spanish-speaking markets across the hemisphere, including in the southwestern United States. While the narrative content, formal qualities, and generic innovations of the films produced in Mexico during this period demand scholarly attention, my research suggests that a full understanding of this period of Mexican cinema history requires attention to material and structural factors, such as systems of distribution, which connect the local and regional to the national and international. Thus, this full account involves accounting for the interconnection of operations in production, distribution, and exhibition, and an acknowledgement that during the Golden Age, the lever of power resided not so much at the point of production, but along multiple points in a transnational system of distribution. Thank you. Yenna, oh, there you are. Hi.
Thank you for the wonderful presentation on this rich history of how multiple stakeholders' interconnected efforts led to a strengthening of national film industry in Mexico. Before we wait for the questions to roll from the audience, I would like to ask a question.
Okay.
So it was just fascinating to hear about how these key actors in the distribution really led to more, of course, better wages, but also the strengthening of national industry. And I wonder how much had to do with sort of the horizontal integration you mentioned at the beginning of the presentation that existed in the national film industry, and how and in what ways did sort of this key actors in the distribution that had a say in this movement, how did that lead to the strengthening of the production sector later as Mexican industry saw more increase in their presence? And yes.
Okay, so this is a really interesting question, and I really appreciate everyone letting me kind of try this out. Because I mean, I think other scholars have been really, really preoccupied with like the strengthening of film production sector, which I'm only sort of interested in, because that's just like one part of the story. And it's actually, I think Andrew Paxman always says the so-called golden age, because really like we have this misperception that like, Mexican audiences, all of a sudden we're seeing Mexican films all the time, and that's actually not true. Actually, they're still seeing American films, lots of them, and the distribution sector is almost solely in American hands. Not completely, but almost solely. Like there are some ventures that start in kind of national distribution. The government steps in at a certain point. But I think that the case of Mexico is really distinct because there are multiple opportunities for key actors to intervene. I think the United States is a much more kind of clear-cut vertical organization. And so the horizontality, it leads to kind of there being, it being open to pressure from different key actors, right? In this case, I guess I was surprised at how important distribution seems to be to this story of the formation of an industry. And I think that in the book length part of project, I'm going to have to make clear that when I say industry, I don't just mean production. Like somehow I'm going to have to draw a picture where all of these things are sort of interconnected and work together, because you can't actually show Mexican films without having exhibitors, and you can't have exhibitors without having American film distributors. So these things are all interconnected in a way that, I mean, Gomez Garcia kind of says that's true today. And I'm like, well, actually that was true then also. So that to me is like kind of an interesting historical phenomenon. Thank you for that question.
No, thank you for the answer. It's great to hear how it's great to really contextualize the resilience and sort of political economic structure around film, which is kind of forgotten in a lot of histories around, national film industry that's very focused on production side. So we have a question from the audience, from Celeste specifically. She says, thank you for sharing your work. You mentioned that some sought to increase local productions related to expanding the local workforce too. For example, I was curious to learn more about issues of representation, where there are important demands about the type of stories and productions that were being produced as well. Thank you.
Well, there's some scholarship. I'm thinking particularly, I forgot, her last name is King, but she's also a historian, but that talk about union workers wanting good representation. And I actually think that we get distracted by the question of representation, to be honest. It's not something that has preoccupied me greatly in my work, because I see union members, and there is the stick. Section number 1 has an archive, and it is in the University of Morelos, which is random. And I only found it by accident. And when I went to visit it last May, they said I was the first scholar to ever visit the archive, that it had been visited by people whose family members had been union members, sometimes just for purely kind of genealogical interest, and sometimes because they needed proof of their family members' longevity in the union. And there was documentation about that. But one of the interesting things that looking in that archive shows you is how much union members, yes, rhetorically, they're often interested in a national film industry, but they're more interested in their material well-being and in gaining. So they do want a national film industry to prosper, but they see themselves as being part of that industry, even if they don't work in the production sector, and they want basically a share of whatever profits are being generated by whatever. And often in the 1940s, there'll be accusations of union members either boycotting films because of content, or asking for certain films to be shown. But it's not clear to me actually how much of that is tactical and how much of that is a genuine concern for reputation. I mean, I think it's really difficult for us to, I remember one summer when Batman Returns was released, which was a while ago now, but in Mexico City, it was like every theater was showing Batman Returns on 3 screens, and so I think it's going to be a shift to think about, yes, people like domestically produced films, they were excited about them, but that their media diets were really heterogeneous, that people also still were really into American films and American stars, and all of these companies were releasing things. So I think in some part, like the union members are really invested in a national film industry, not necessarily because of representational issues, but because of kind of real material well-being issues, like wanting a productive sector, that because by the 40s that the cinema sector employs a lot of people, and it creates jobs, and those are jobs not just in production but also in these other kind of job venues like distribution offices or in theaters, et cetera. And everyone could be in the union, like from the janitorial staff to ticket takers to night watchmen, et cetera. So it was a really kind of stable and good gig to have at the time. I hope that sort of answered your question. I'm always regretful that I'm not more interested in issues of representation, but other people have that passion. So I can focus intently on these other sorts of questions.
Great. We have another question from the audience, from Sarah. They said, thank you for your work. How much rough percentage of archival data were you able to access in the US and Mexico? And what were some challenges with the archive?
Okay, well, that is a great question. So before I found the Sindicatos archive, which I only spent a few days with, and I'm going to go back and spend more time because I went to look at it. I was a little bit unsure, having looked at the finding aid, what exactly was in it and how it could be useful to me. And I wanted to look at it and kind of think a little bit more about what questions I could ask of it or how I needed to approach it. So I think that's a really valuable resource. Of course, it only tells the story of kind of one of a lot of sections of film-related unions. I also found material in the AGN, the National Archive, although less than one might imagine. Sort of the mother lode, strangely, of archival material is in the National Archives in the United States. And that's because the US State Department was really interested in promoting US business interests. So even before World War II, they produced a lot of reports and data and analyses and et cetera, and it's all preserved in triplicate in the National Archives. I even need to go back. So I would say that those things, and also the Hemeroteca Nacional has some film-related trade journals, Mexican trade journals, that I feel like haven't adequately been mined. So that there was a great opportunity to spend time with those and to see how I'm particularly interested in, this is kind of a strange interest, but I'm interested in the social world of the Mexican film industry. Like I noticed, this is true of all industries, but people are having dinner, people are throwing parties, people are documenting when executives from the United States come to Mexico and what kind of deals they're making and who gets promoted and who is working in a new place. And I'm trying to map out that social thing. So I think it's challenging because sometimes archival practices tend to mirror the preoccupations of the people who are preserving them. So if we want to know about the production of specific films, it might be easier to access information in that way because that's a kind of common organization of media-related archives, right? So what is the title, or organized by creative personnel or something like that, and not so much, I think business has really not been the focus of archival practices necessarily. Thank you for that great question.
Awesome. We have another question from Alejandro in the audience. Thanks for this presentation, Laura. I wanted to know if during the strike or later, did other countries, European or Latin American, besides the US, try to enter the Mexican film market? I'm thinking of the Argentine case where even though American distributors were dominant in the 1930s, German, Italian, and French distributors were able to dispute at least parts of the market.
That's such a great question, Alejandro. Thank you. So there are from the 1930s going forward, there are Mexicans actually with ties to, for example, France, business ties to France and other countries. And they actively work to promote and kind of offer, for example, French film as an alternative to Mexican film and say like, well, really, we should turn to these kind of international distributors to help fill these gaps. So these strikes do create some opportunities for the films of other countries to enter the Mexican market and to be presented as a kind of alternative fare. So I would say that it's not a huge part of the market, but that these kind of various interruptions, it's almost like kind of thinking about distribution as a circuit, like the circuit gets disrupted and then there's the opportunity for another circuit to emerge, even if temporarily, until that main circuit is kind of set right again.
Great. I will then pass on the floor to Facundo.
Thank you, Jena. Thank you, Professor Serna. This was a fascinating story. I learned so much from the talk. So my question is kind of like from the second period, like this second story you mentioned about the kind of like the fractures of the unions and the labor workers, like after like this long period of like homogeneity in some way. So I'm curious about like, how do you see what happened like in terms of like what led you to, like, beside these ideas of like corruption cases and like these internal divisions in the labor union as a whole, were always like homogeneous, or is it like this like before and after, or like and what is like beside these corruption cases, if you can speak a little bit more about what you think are like the driving forces of these conflicting interests about within the same like union or within this idea of unions as a whole, and yeah, if you can speak a little more about that, it will be great.
Yeah, thanks for that question, Facundo. So, I mean, I was really trying to see kind of some similarities, actually, like just thinking about how distribution can, like, no matter what the conflict, distribution is the kind of the battleground on which it's fought. Like, people are just trying to stop the movement of media, right? We're going to kind of hole up this circulation circuit. But in terms of why the STPC kind of breaks off from the stick, I mean, I think that essentially, and this is going to be very brief, is that the people who work in production feel like they have a very different relationship to labor. It's almost as if they're, you know, I think my colleague Nitin Goval would say, they're deciding what the industry is. And they decide that the industry is production, right? That they have this special relationship to producing films, and they're working in the studios. And these are extras, script supervisors, office workers, et cetera. But they're working in the context of the studio and working specifically on film production. And I think that they begin to develop this idea that the work that they do is so distinct from the work that a empacador does, right, in this office, who's like dealing with film cans and labeling them and sending them off, that they really want their own representation. I mean, the corruption is like this really fascinating sidebar about it, but it really, I think, comes down to how they think a union is going to represent their interests, and a decision that somehow the cinema workers can no longer be unified under this huge umbrella that includes projectionists and, as I said, ticket takers, et cetera. So there's kind of a differentiation of labor as the production sector kind of becomes more stable and becomes more consistent. Then there's a kind of way in which those workers want to differentiate what they do from the work that other people do. Whereas in the early 1930s, there are not really that many production workers to think of. They're like bringing people from the United States. They're like, there's some people who dabbled they're like, okay, these people sort of know what they're doing, but it's really maybe more artisanal or less professional. And so in the mid-1940s, they decide like, well, this is actually a real thing. And so that process is kind of fascinating to me, is like a kind of discursive creation of an industry and deciding what counts as the industry. Now, the workers of STIC are like, the distribution workers still see themselves as cinema workers, and hold on to that really dearly up until April of 2023, when they were having their beautiful celebration and ceremony about their labor. So that's kind of actually the process that I'm really interested in teasing out, is like, how do people decide what an industry is and what its component parts are, and kind of where they, and I don't think it's straightforward, right? Because clearly there's a contest here between different kinds of workers who think that they are the industry. Okay, well, we're coming to the hour.
Yes, but can I steal a minute extra of your time? I can't resist asking the following question. I know you said at the beginning and in our previous exchange that, you know, the digital world and, you know, the contemporary scene is not your area of expertise, but I couldn't avoid thinking, listening to your presentation, how important it is to the current moment in which distribution is what it's at for film and entertainment, right? And the discursive construction of the industry itself. Is Amazon a movie studio now, as opposed to, right? Apple, you know, my watch, and now is, you know, streaming, making film. So if you were to summarize parallels between the period that you are studying and the present, understanding that there was only only one Cantinflas, and there will be no other Cantinflas, unfortunately, for those of us who grew up watching him. But what would you say are the main sort of areas of difference between the past and the present? Perhaps some areas of continuity, and what are some lessons that your historical analysis can bring to those who want to study distribution, which is a very important side of struggle now in the contemporary moment?
Well, thinking about differences first, I mean, there's the material differences, right? So there's, I mean, distribution today has an infrastructure, we just don't see it, right? Because it's in cables and it's like digital versus kind of material. So there's that difference. I think another difference, at least in this story of Mexico, is that there are these huge, they're like big guys and little guys. And today it seems like there are lots of big guys kind of fighting for this terrain. But some parallels are that distribution is key. If you don't have a platform, you don't have media. It doesn't exist. And that the labor of distribution is actually a really fascinating site of inquiry. Like, who facilitates the production of platforms, the writing of algorithms, the marketing, like all of this labor that is not quote unquote creative labor that is ripe for analysis, I think, because we get so caught up in like either top level kind of company, what are companies doing, or what are creatives doing, which is also fascinating, and kind of forget about all this other activity that is integral to bringing media from its point of production to its point of reception. So I guess that's how I would answer that question. So I think there are things to say.
Absolutely. No, it was a great seminar. Thank you so much for sharing your work with us. Thank you, Yana, for terrific moderation as always, and to our great audience for the great questions. And I invite everybody to join us for the next installment of this virtual seminar series. Have a wonderful rest of your weeks.
Thank you.